there have been a number of things that have taken place that have really compromised certain aspects of Christian baptism. I want to walk through a little bit of history in this video and share some thoughts on some very influential people who have made some decisions over the years that have led to a situation that I believe has hijacked Christian baptism in certain circles. If you ask the question to a number of Christians, who can baptize someone? You're going to get a wide range of answers based on their denominational affiliation, based on their history and understanding. Now, if you go to the Bible never tells us who can baptize someone. That is never instructed. We do have examples, and it's quite a range of people. It's everyone from the disciples during the ministry of Jesus, John the Baptist during the ministry and previous to the ministry of Jesus, the believers in Acts chapter 2. Peter preaches, 3,000 are baptized, but guess what? Doesn't say who did it. A little bit later, you have Philip being appointed a deacon, and then Philip baptizing the Ethiopian. So now you have a deacon baptizing people. You have in Acts 18 and 1 Corinthians 1, Paul baptizing Crispus and Gaius. You also have Lydia, her family, and the jailer's family. Paul and Silas are there. And apparently one or the other both baptized these families. It doesn't say who. Acts 10, Cornelius' family is converted. Peter being present. Maybe Peter baptized them. We don't know. Guess what? Doesn't say. In Acts chapter 8, we have the apostles staying back in Jerusalem, and the persecuted believers leave Jerusalem and spread the message everywhere they go. There's great rejoicing, much joy, and apparently there are people who are being reached. There are probably new home churches sprouting up. Who did the baptizing? The Bible never makes a big deal out of that. But over time, in certain corners of the church, who does the baptizing has been made way too big of a deal of. And there have been rules constructed in order to maintain control, in order to maintain order, in order to maintain orthodoxy, so that heresies are not promulgated. So instead of the New Testament, that does not make any big deal out of this whatsoever. We have found in certain aspects, certain periods of time in church history, that people created rules around baptism and who is ordained, who has been qualified or approved to do the work, where the Bible itself never lays out anything like that at all. There is no ordination requirements. There is no ordination in the contemporary sense in the Bible. Now, they do appoint elders, they do lay hands on people and things like that, but as far as what we see today in ordination processes that then give permission for administering sacraments and things like that, none of that's in the Bible. And one of the things that I love about home church is it strips all that stuff down, and it brings it back to the 1 Peter chapter 2, 9 through 11. Priesthood of all believers, which is how God intended this to be, that we are all a royal priesthood. There's not a special class with special vestments, special gear, standing in special places. Those things are very Catholic. Those things were later innovations. And so let's look a little bit at the history of some of this. And part of this, in all fairness to them at the time, was because the church was going through various heresies, and they were creating protective walls to keep people from getting into heresy and keep from getting into things that they're not orthodox. So in the early 2nd century, you have Ignatius of Antioch, and he begins restricting the administration of the sacraments and who is able to baptize people, that it must be either a bishop or somebody the bishop approves. Close to that time, the Didache is written, and it offers baptismal instructions, but does not specify that it must be an ordained clergy. So this happens a little bit after that, more like Ignatius of Antioch. Then you get into the time of Constantine, the rise of the Roman Catholic Church. Hierarchy within the church begins to become very solidified because they are seeking to bring order to the empire. And now you have this idea that the church is working in conjunction with the official government in order to help bring unity to the empire, which is really not a great idea. So then by the 4th century, there becomes more specificity with ordination, and this restriction of baptism to the clergy became even more solidified. And again, a lot of this is the rationale of we need to have order, we need to be orthodox, we cannot allow in heresies. So in other words, we can't just let anybody do this because we don't know what they're teaching, what they're saying. If we just leave this out to the heathens and the barbarians out there to start doing the things that the church is supposed to be doing, then we're not really sure that this is being administered correctly. And what you end up doing is you end up exerting a lot of control and creating a lot of rules that the Bible itself does not create, which then hijacks baptism and makes it subservient to, in a sense, kind of the rules of the magisterium. Now, to be perfectly fair, there were some things along the way where people made some exceptions, and they said, okay, basically this is the way that this needs to go. It needs to be ordained people. But at the same time, we recognize that there might be exceptional circumstances where some layperson needs to do this, and as long as they do it by the right way and saying the right words, then it's kind of okay, but it's really not the way that we prefer. The Council of Trent in the 1500s was part of this, where that was exactly what was stated. And then we get into around the 1500s, the Protestant reformers, and we see some of these very, very same things. Here's Calvin and his Institutes, Book 4, Chapter 15, Section 20. He said, "It is here also pertinent to observe that it is improper for private individuals to take upon themselves the administration of baptism, for it is, as well as the dispensation of the supper, is part of the ministerial office. For Christ did not give command to any men or women whatever to baptize, but to those whom he appointed as apostles. For the laity to baptize in danger of death when a minister could not be present in time cannot, it appears to me, be defended on sufficient grounds. Even the early Christians who observed or tolerated this practice were not clear whether it were rightly done. This doubt is expressed by Augustine when he states, although a laic have given baptism when compelled by necessity, I know not whether anyone can piously say that it ought to be repeated, for it is done without any necessary compelling. It is usurpation of another's office, but if necessity urges, it is either no fault or a venial one." So that goes all the way back to Augustine, that he's even saying, not so sure about this. And Calvin makes it very clear that although this does happen, it's really not so certain that it should be happening. And he states that it was only the apostles who did the baptizing. It's as if he doesn't even really know his New Testament. That's very odd to me. Then you have the Augsburg Confession, which is the primary confessional document of the Lutheran Church, that states, "It is taught that no one should publicly teach, preach, or administer the sacraments without a proper public call," in Article 14. Luther also believed that ordained people should be doing the baptizing. He said that there could be exception where the laity does this, but it's really not recommended. There were things going on at these times where these people were trying to protect the faith, and we can understand that they were trying to keep things in-house. They were trying to maintain order. In a sense, they're really trying to maintain some sense of control in the name of God, in the name of the Scriptures, but in essence, they're adding rules to the Scriptures where the rules did not exist. And if you know anything about Luther, he was about the priesthood of all believers, and that's part of his rationale of saying, well, the laity, it can happen, but really kind of shouldn't be the way it goes. A few things to consider here. Again, the New Testament does not make a big deal whatsoever about who does the baptizing, whether it be man, woman, or child. The work in baptism is the work that God is doing. If you want to get obsessed over the person who is doing the baptizing, you could say, well, I was baptized by an ordained minister, but they were a child molester. Does my baptism now not count? Or they had some secret sin and they really were lost, but I had no idea, but they sure were ordained, right? I'm not saying I would want a Satanist to baptize me. That's not what I'm saying. But there is no rule in the New Testament about who does this work because it's God's work. And the word in the New Testament for baptism is usually in the passive voice, which means it's an action that we receive because it's God's action working on us to wash us, to clothe us, Galatians 3:27, to unite us with the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. This is the work of God in us, not the work of the other person, as if that person who's laying their hands on you and saying the things is like doing God's work for God. No, God is doing the work. We surrender and submit to it. Now, there's another second point here, and that has to do with English translations of the word baptizo. It's another way that this word got hijacked, because when the 1611 King James was translated, King James gave some rules to the translators, and he said basically keep it as much like the Bishop's Bible as possible. So the KJV 1611 is basically a Bishop's Bible revised. The Bishop's Bible had a lot of influence from Tyndale's translation of the Bible, and Tyndale used the word baptize. Bishop's Bible used the word baptize. King James used the word baptize. And some of the rationale for that, people believe, is that they were not immersing, they were sprinkling infants. And they realized that if they actually translated that word to the word immerse, that they would have some major headaches and political issues within the church, because it would have to change practices that had evolved over the years that are not New Testament practices. Sprinkling, pouring, all that are not New Testament practices. They're later church innovations. And to actually translate that word would cause headaches. So no, just transliterate it. What does that mean? We go baptizo, Greek word, to English word baptism. We just take the Greek sounding letters and make them into the same word in English in the way it sounds. And that allows us to avoid the complications that are going to be involved if we actually accurately translate that term. The word means to dip. The word means to submerge. The word means to immerse. Here's what Everett Ferguson said in Baptism in the Early Church. He said, baptizo means to dip, usually through submerging, but it also meant to overwhelm, and so could be used whether the object was placed in an element or was overwhelmed by it. Pouring and sprinkling were distinct actions that were represented by different verbs, and this usage too continued in Christian sources. When the latter speak of the pouring out of the Holy Spirit or the sprinkling of blood, they do not use baptize or baptizo for those actions. So if you go to this document that was with the 1611 KJV, there's a document called From the Translators to the Reader. And the translators offered up their thoughts on various things about their translation to kind of give you a heads up about some stuff. Here's what they wrote specifically about baptism, baptizo. This is the second to last paragraph in this document, which I'll link to in the description. Lastly, we have on the one side avoided the scrupulosity of the Puritans who leave the old ecclesiastical words and betake them to other. In other words, we say baptize, but they don't want to keep to those old ecclesiastical words like baptize. No, the Puritans have thrown those words out and they've gone with something else. They have innovated. And it says, so they take on another, they betake another, as when they put washing for baptism and congregation instead of church. Okay? So they're saying we didn't decide to translate these words because the Puritans did that and we don't think they made good decisions, and so we're just trying not to make the same mistake they made. What they're really kind of doing here is they're trying to maintain their church practices, and they're saying if you just sprinkle a couple of drops on a baby's head, that's not washing or immersing, because you're manipulating the scriptures in order to prop up a practice that is not authorized by the scriptures themselves. Just like with ordination. Making up rules to prop up practices that are pre-existing, that were created in order to head off problems or heresies, in order to maintain control and order. I understand that. I get the desire to maintain unity, uniformity, even as a control, but to keep things in check. They're trying not to go off the rails here, right? Through man-made rules, traditions, and manipulating the scriptures in order to maintain these practices. Home church helps us with this because we are meeting in a home. We are laity, right? We don't have this laity-clergy divide. We practice the priesthood of all believers, 1 Peter 2, 9 through 11, and the usage of gifts. And we are not ordaining people to administer the sacraments to us because that's not biblical. That is extra biblical. That is tradition. That is addition to what the Bible has to say. It's man-made rules. And it actually hampers and hinders the body. And so in home church, when there is someone who needs to be baptized, there's no restriction on who can do the baptizing. It could be a man, woman, or child. A teenager can baptize their friend. A woman can baptize the lady she's been studying with. A man can baptize it's like God did not see fit for some reason to delineate rules when it comes to the person who is doing the actions, because I think that God wanted to emphasize, this is my opinion, but I believe God wants to emphasize that He is the one doing the action. Let's go back to Paul for a minute. He said, man, I'm so glad that I didn't baptize very many of you. The reason is because they were saying, well, I got baptized by Peter. I got baptized by Paul. I got baptized by Apollos. And they were making this big show out of who got baptized by who. Well, maybe God knows our human nature, and He knows that we're going to assign value to these things that ought not to have value assigned to them. And so God doesn't make a big deal out of who does that, because He's the one doing the work. He's the one giving the Spirit, Acts 2:38. He's the one forgiving the sins, Acts 2:38. He's the one uniting us with Christ through His death, burial, and resurrection, Romans 6, and Colossians 2:12. He's the one clothing us with Christ, Galatians 3:27. It's God's work. We are just here to facilitate. That's it. So I'm appreciative of our home church people, And if you're in a home church, I would really want to emphasize that when someone comes to faith in Christ, that we want to point them to God's work through baptism. This is not our work. This is not meriting salvation. It's God's work in baptism. So that's the thought for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm going to put up another video on baptism that might give you like a little bit more teaching and things to think about so that we have the proper practices that are biblical practices. Don't just do this or think this because I'm saying it. Go look it up. Go do your study. See what's there. Understand the words. And then go and do likewise. So watch this video, hit like and subscribe, and we'll see you again soon. Take care.